Yes.
Chairman, panel members, ladies and gentlemen, the next witness and the final witness today is Dr. Margaret Humphreys, beg your pardon, of the Child Migrants Trust.
Dr. Humphreys, do you wish to affirm or to take an oath?
Take the oath.
It's a matter for you entirely. Very well. Would you take the Bible, please, in your right hand? And if you'd stand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Humphreys, for those who do not know, you are the International Director of the Child Migrants Trust, which is an organisation that you yourself founded in 1987 following an initial approach from a lady who'd been born in the UK but who was living in Australia and who was seeking her family in England. And that organisation now provides a specialist independent social work service to Britain's former child migrants and their families. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, you, at the request of the inquiry, provided a detailed and very helpful report which can be found in the bundle at page AUS 6001. That could be put up, please, and it goes right through to 6035. And in that report, you outline the work of the Trust and provide an assessment of the effect on those children who were migrated to Australia from Northern Ireland and with whom the Trust has been involved. This is the cover of your report here, and we can see that there are two photographs, if we can just scroll down a little bit, please. And they're both taken in 1947, and they're groups of children, and I see that their segregation had started there. There's a group of boys and a group of girls who were on the Asturias, which was a ship that sailed and took children in 1947 to Australia, and some of them had come from Northern Ireland. Now, I don't propose to go through your report in detail. You can take it that the inquiry panel and members of the inquiry have had the opportunity to read it and to go through it, and I am going to make reference, I've made some reference to it in my report earlier today, yes, but I'm also going to go through it, summarising some of the sections and affording you the opportunity to expand on those sections or to add anything that you feel you haven't given us in sufficient detail in the report. So if we can just look, the first section was an introduction, and then section 2, you talk about set out some statistics about child migrants who went to Australia from Northern Ireland, and I don't propose to go through those. We can move on to section 3, which is at page 6006. And you talk at section 3 about the institutional experiences in Northern Ireland at the bottom of that page, and say that the lack of attachments or continuity of family life deprive children of the basic building blocks of identity and any context for developing a narrative about personal experience and events. Now, that would have been a common theme with any child who was brought up in an institution, that institutional experience had that effect. Isn't that correct?
Well, part of that is correct, but I mean, there are cultural contexts, a whole range of things when you look at sending a child from Ireland, Northern Ireland particularly, to the other side of the world.
Yes, I think we're going to come back and talk about the specifics relation to children, yes, who came from Northern Ireland, but certainly in that section you also relate what the Trust has learned from those who were sent from Northern Ireland institutions and with whom you had dealings, about their experiences in institutions here, first of all.
Absolutely.
And much of what is recited in this section, the inquiry has actually heard directly from those who spoke about their experiences in the 2 Derry homes, and that's the point I was trying to make, is that there was a common experience for those children who were migrated and those who remained here.
The institutional experience.
Yes.
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 Understand.
And we will be calling witnesses in this module also to speak about what they remember of their time in the care homes here in Northern Ireland before they were migrated. Then if we just move on through your report to section 4, And again, I hope you don't feel that I'm glossing over this in any way, and if you think that there's something that you wish to interrupt me and say, I'd like to say a little bit more about that, please do. But in section 4 you talk about what the Trust has learned from those with whom it has worked about the process for selection. And at paragraph 4.4 you say that the process appears to have been driven primarily by need to fulfil quotas under pressure from British Catholic rescue societies in response to demand from the Australian Federal Catholic Immigration Committee, which at times became quite insistent, particularly as fewer children were available through the 1950s. And you say there's supporting evidence available. Without asking you to pull up that evidence, could you maybe just explain a little bit about that?
Well, I think you spoke about it in some detail this morning, didn't you? What was about the motivation and the thrust and where was it all coming from? And some of the pressure was clearly coming from Australia, 50,000 children in the post-war years, always white children, of course, given their Australia's immigration policy at that time.
I didn't actually mention, but there was a policy called the White Immigration Policy.
That's correct, yes, and that applied to child migrants as well. So only white children were sent to Australia as part of the child migration policy.
And it's clear from what you've been told that there was little or no preparation for emigration for these children.
I don't think, I haven't heard anyone, given your opening address this morning and the requirements prior to migration, I don't think I've met a child migrant who describes their preparation in the terms you outlined this morning. Mainly the narrative is one of being, you're going to Australia, you're going for a holiday, you're going next week. Many child migrants didn't realise they would never be coming back, thought it was a holiday. So hardly preparation for a life the other side of the world and never to return again.
So although what I was talking about this morning was the actual process of the consents that had to be obtained, the medical examination and the forms that had to be filled in, and we've just heard a little from the last witness about there was supposed to be an interview, and some children did go to Australia House to be interviewed. If that did happen, that hasn't formed part of the conscious memory of the people with whom you've been dealing. Would that be fair?
I think that's a fair comment. I think I have spoken to people who were migrated with the Fairbridge scheme who do remember going to Australia House and in fact have a photograph of that. So I think it happened in some circumstances, not many, and my recollection is that it only relates to Fairbridge. Yes.
And just to be clear, there were no children from Northern Ireland, as far as the inquiries are concerned, or have you anything to say to the country who went from Northern Ireland to Fairbridge?
No, I don't think so.
Section 5, you address the issue of parental knowledge and consent for migration, and paragraph 5.4, you say that from the Trust's experience, few Northern Irish parents gave written consent, while the majority were not informed that their children had left the country. Many parents describe a similar deception to the example above, and that's, I should say, in the preceding paragraph you gave an example of what one mother had told you about going to seek her child. And the analysis of 54 Northern Ireland child migration forms, shows that parental consent was given in 7 of those. Evidence of consent of each child is available within the child migration selection documents which accompanied the children to Australia and are now held by the National Archives of Australia. Now, this is one thing that Dr. McVeigh was talking about and in conjunction with Ms. Doherty, our panel member. The ages that these children went to, it could hardly have been informed consent that they would have been engaged in, isn't that correct? The forms specify whether consent was given by a parent or legal guardian, but usually the forms that you saw were by the Mother Superior of the institution.
By and large, yes, absolutely. We've brought consent forms here, we've brought evidence here if you'd like to look at that.
Thank you, that would be most helpful. Certainly the forms that we have been provided by those people who have spoken to the inquiry also would disclose that quite a few of them were signed by a member of the order who was sending.
I would think the majority.
And you say that it's not known whether the institutions made any effort to consult with parents prior to the migration of their children due to the limited paperwork for most former child migrants from Nazareth houses.
Well, look, evidence. I think that what the Trust has is evidence, all evidence, remembrance from mothers. And of course, mothers being alive now, of course, are less and less. So their voice in this inquiry, I hope, is going to be heard. In all the mothers I've met, they hadn't known that their children had been sent to Australia. A few had been told their children had died. Others had been told their children had been adopted. But I hadn't met any mother from their child that had been sent to Australia who knew that they'd been sent.
And can I just ask, maybe, and it's pertinent to what the quotation that you've cited in your report, those mothers there has been some discussion about abandoned or deserted children or orphan children, but in your experience, the mothers that you have had dealings with in Child Migrant Trust, had those parents given up on their children?
Well, it's always an interesting question, who abandoned who, isn't it? And in this particular context, it's a very broad question, who abandoned child migrants? Certainly their country. And I think Gordon Brown alluded to that in his apology, in a sense. Did mothers abandon their children? Well, what does abandonment mean? Emotionally abandon their children? That's not the voice I hear from mothers. Leaving them in a place of safety, that's hardly abandonment, is it?
I suppose what I was trying to get at, Dr. Humphreys, was from what you've heard from the mothers, did they, after they placed their child in this, what they perceived to be a place of safety, did they continue to try to have contact with the children, or did they come seeking them at a later date, or what can you tell us about that, rather than the actual concept of abandonment?
I understand, as you, I'm sure, all appreciate that words like abandonment and rejection in this context, we have to really define what we mean by that, I think. So sorry, but I understand what your meaning is. Mothers often say that they went to see their children. Some mothers went to see their children only to be found that they'd gone. So going to visit, child not there. That's the experience of some. Some mothers were made to feel, they say they were made to feel awful. Look, mothers of child migrants, of which I've met a large number, not just in Northern Ireland, but across the schemes to the Commonwealth, live with guilt, live with shame, and live with endless mourning, a bereavement without end. That's what they go on to live with. The guilt and shame, of course, is all ours, is society's, not theirs. But it's an endless mourning process. By the time the CMT, the Trust, gets to meet with mothers, it's 40 years, it's 50 years on. And their recollections are clear.
Well, can I, just on another point that's in this section of your report, where you use the word deception that was perpetrated effectively on these families, if I may, and was that common in Northern Ireland as well as across the board, or was it more particular in this jurisdiction or not? Can you say anything about that?
The deception, you mean, is it more particular to Northern Ireland than anywhere else in child migration? I don't think so. I don't think so.
And if we just... point, of course, was it less common here, or was it, broadly speaking, the same?
I think it just fits in with child migration as a policy, as a practice, how it was operated. Its outcomes, they're all pretty similar. In terms of what the children were told as children, and then as the years went by and they were young adults, asking about family.
being told that they didn't have a family or...
Yes, exactly, a range of things. You were orphans. I think the Trust has only over all these years met one, possibly two people whose parents had both died at the time or just before migration. So this wasn't a policy about orphans in the sense that we understand that term and that word.
Right,
and that is a deception in a sense, isn't it? To have a scheme, a migration scheme, to send children to the other side of the world, which is about children that don't have parents. And you talk about orphans, that's a deception.
If I may move on from that point, and you say that it's in section 6 you talk about the placements in Australia and the summary of institutional care, and you say that the children went mostly to institutions, those who went from Northern Ireland, run by Sisters of Mercy, Sister Nazareth or Christian Brothers, and that went on until the late 1950s, and you recite there the names, most of which I've already mispronounced this morning, in that paragraph, and 3 of those institutions were included in the Home Office blacklist following the Ross report in 1956, and recommended that no children should be sent there until several improvements be carried out. Now, we know though that children did go to those homes.
Well, the children kept
afterwards.
going, didn't they? For the Ross report, the children kept going.
And you talk about the type of abuse to which they were subject in those homes. And at paragraph 6.6, you say that they, one of the things that they have said to you, if we could just pause there, that despite the high levels of serious criminal assaults, and it's quite clear from the accounts that we have had that certainly is both physical and sexual assaults were perpetrated on these children in Australia, you say that the conviction rate for perpetrators is very low. Only one perpetrator has received a custodial sentence in the early 90s for assaults against former child migrants. Legal actions have failed over the years to deliver justice. Former child migrants frequently express great frustration that while perpetrators walk free, they feel sentenced to a lifetime of suffering. So there's been a general frustration of the lack of prosecutions. Is that a view generally held by those to whom you've spoken?
I think it is. Lack of truth, lack of justice.
And you go on to describe in the same section how they came, some of them came to leave the homes that they were in, and the effect that had. There seemed to be a distinct lack of preparation for leaving these institutions. Is that correct?
Well, absolutely. I think a lack of preparation runs across child migration, lack of preparation to send children to the other side of the world, a lack of preparation to prepare them for a world outside an institution.
And in fact, that some of them discovered when they did leave that in fact they had no documentation, which was a difficulty for them in obtaining employment or going on into any form of education, or indeed for getting married and so forth.
Well,
isn't that correct?
Indeed, citizenship. When I first met child migrants going back 88, 89 and thereon, many weren't indeed citizens of Australia. They had no citizenship at all.
And if we can just scroll down then to the next section in paragraph 7, you talk about this difficulty with access to records, which has been one of the critical issues for the child migrants, partly because of the modern day life requires that we all have records and have proof of identity and so forth, but that this has been had detrimental consequences for them in particular, because very few or limited records accompanied them to Australia. And this would seem to be in spite of the fact that the schemes were devised so that there would be material accompanying them and information accompanying them.
Well, it clearly didn't, did it?
And even then, they struggled to obtain the few details provided, given the resistance of both government and faith-based agencies to enable access to even the most basic information, such as their birth certificate. And whether to reduce costs or limit vital details to the minimum, agencies only sent short birth certificates with child migrants to Australia, which didn't include, the short form birth certificate doesn't include the parents' names. And you feel that might have been an attempt to protect some children from the stigma of illegitimacy illegitimacy, but it was undermined by institutional staff regularly then using derogatory references to illegitimacy when speaking at them when they were supposed to be caring for them in their homes. And you give a quotation from one of the people that you've dealt with who said that they were described as the sons of Irish whores. And can I just ask about one of the things that we have had complaints made to us about is the fact that a child's date of birth, for example, was changed or his name was changed. And sometimes one person, I think, relates that they were looked at by a brother who said, you look about 10 and you were born on such and such a date. And for years that person believed that was his date of birth until eventually, through the work, I think, of yourselves, they discovered that in fact the brother was right about the year, but not actually about the actual date of birth. And that obviously will have caused major difficulties, not just for accessing records and seeking to find out who you are, but what kind of impact has that had on the psyche of these people?
Well, I mean, if we talk about our identity and what we all come to understand about our identities, it's about our parents, it's about who we belong to, it's about where we were born, that special day of our birth. I mean, it's a cultural issue, birthdays, isn't it? And a whole range of other things, legal requirements, a whole range of things. Well, I guess if you're not wanting these children to come back and never find their families, one of the things that you might do is to, of course, ensure they don't know their parents' names. You can't find your parents if you don't know who they are. The psychological impact, you see often child migrants write about their lives, talk to us, talk to people, is what is the common thread here? I felt a nobody, special to nobody, belong to nobody. That's rather in contrast to your introduction this morning when you looked at the provision for safeguarding those kinds of issues clearly weren't carried out.
So it would appear that while there was a scheme devised to create safeguards for these child migrants, it wasn't put into practice in that sense? Obviously
not. You've got hundreds of adult people who, up until 25 years ago, didn't know their proper names, their dates of birth, didn't have citizenship, didn't have passports because they hadn't got the documentation to get a passport, had difficulty getting married, a whole range of factors. The consequences of the child migration schemes are many.
And can I just ask you, in this section again, you talk about the resistance that the child migrant, it's at page, paragraph 7.9, which is at page 6013, please. Yes, you talk here, in fact, in paragraph 7, you say that in the early days, the Trust, when it was trying to find out information from the people who were coming forward to you, you encountered a resistant attitude from both government and faith-based agencies in relation to the identification and retrieval of records. Most agencies appeared to have little notion of what they held or any straightforward way of accessing it. Information was sometimes provided in a minimalist and grudging manner, yet this was a critical issue for those living overseas who had been subjected to enormous loss and disadvantage through government policy and church practice. Now, pausing there for a moment, we are going to come later. I'm going to ask you to take through the case study, the example that you've given as an annex to this report in detail, but it's clear from that particular example, if you had been given the right information at the outset, much time might have been saved in finding the right information, as it were, and getting people together, reuniting people. So this difficulty that you experienced, how long did it actually take before things changed?
Well, I think the Health Select Committee focused a lot on records at that time. if we couldn't get the records, if we couldn't get information, how were we going to provide informed and professional services for child migrants? And I used to say all the time, every day counts here. Every single day counts, and there'll be a list of people whose mothers and fathers will die while we're failing to take, well, basically humanitarian action. That's what was required, quickly and decisively. So I think that brought about some change, some level of awareness. So the Health Select Committee chose, I think I've heard them say recently, the chair say recently, that that records became their paramount objective. If the records were there, could we have the records? Could we move forward in providing identity, giving a narrative, finding families while there was still time? So it took time.
May I pause there and ask why you feel that we were talking about the 90s, the late 1980s, early 1990s.
In the 90s, yes, mid-90s.
Why do you feel there was such resistance at that time?
Look, I suppose there are many explanations, and the agencies themselves must say what the resistance was and why. Perhaps there weren't the records, perhaps there were some records, but the paucity of information on some records, it was very, very limited. And of course, as time moves on and child migrants themselves are talking to you, talking to the Royal Commission around their experiences both in Australia and in their homeland. We're learning more and more that abuse took place in institutions in their homeland, not just in Northern Ireland, but you're looking at Northern Ireland, so we're beginning to learn that. And there is a feeling among child migrants at the moment that perhaps that's why they were sent, to cover the abuse that had taken place here, only to be sent to some organisations, not all, but some in Australia, where there was a culture of abusing children. So whether that was a strand within the reluctance and the reticence to be open about record. Look, to be open about the records was to give a chance for every child migrant to have what most of us take for granted. Parents, family, knowing where we came from, a sense of identity. So I think the question is for those very agencies, really.
Well, you do talk about one of the agencies, and at paragraph 7.9, you say that the reality is that the Sisters of Nazareth record-keeping practices were woefully inadequate and little information is generally available.
Yes.
Was that specific to Northern Ireland or throughout the UK?
Oh, look, I think it's generally throughout. I mean, we're focusing on Northern Ireland, so I think I'd want to put it in the larger perspective. I think the records, we have found Nazareth House records to be
well, I think you describe it there
yes,
as woefully inadequate.
I think you'd support that. Yeah, woefully inadequate, absolutely.
And did that contrast with other agencies who you were, for example, we've heard about the Fairbridge Society, where their record,
yes.
Was that their record keeping better?
I think the history is better, yes, the circumstances, the lead up to the migration, and where, yes, I think so.
One of the other things that you mentioned that is specific to Northern Ireland, if we can just scroll down, was the difficulty that you had with the General Register Office in Belfast, and you say records of birth, death, marriage, key elements of any search for missing family members, and until recent years, records from the General Register Office in Belfast were difficult to access and required a personal visit.
Yes.
I take it part of that was the lack of technology
yes.
that there may have been
yes.
in the records, but was there anything other? Was the distance in travelling across from...
Look, I don't think so. I mean, in those days, particularly, every day counted, and to get a birth certificate, a marriage certificate, you know, we would have liked to have had a relationship with them where we could have done it on the telephone. And I think that we found them absolutely not warm to that approach. So we would be flying into Belfast all the time to spend days checking births, marriages and deaths.
Okay. Then
I think that situation's improved. Let me say that now. Yes.
But you say then, Section 8, moving on, you talk about family tracing experiences, and you describe the need for CMT services. You say that the task of locating a family is one which individuals can't do without the help of agencies such as your own, and you outline in detail the practical difficulties faced by an individual, particularly in the situation where there has been misinformation, and not least of one of the difficulties for the child migrants has been the physical distance, and the sensitivities that occur in reuniting families is addressed here. And you say that that too is something which ought not to be undertaken without a degree of expertise and sensitivity. If I can scan on down to section 9. In section 9 you go on to outline the impact of separation and trauma from those Northern Irish child migrants with whom you have been involved. And at 9.1 you use the word catastrophic, which is a very strong word, and yet you say that language struggles to reflect the experiences of those. And I wanted to ask you, was the impact of separation and trauma greater in your experience for those children who came from Northern Ireland than for those who came from other parts of the United Kingdom?
Was it greater? Look, I think for children who are from Ireland and from Northern Ireland, there was that extra strand of identity and culture that was lost to them. And they were very much part of, in the very early days, we used to have large, I can't say group meetings, people would just arrive and there'd probably be 150 people would be outside, and easily the Irish child migrants would know each other, and there was a great loss. A great loss and an affinity. There was an immediate affinity. We're Irish. They'd all say to me, we're Irish. You come from Ireland. So there's that part of loss of identity, loss of connectedness, being away from home, being Irish, being with children who weren't from Ireland. The majority of children were from other places in England, or for some people from Malta.
Forgive me, I'm trying to explore this a little bit more, but obviously being Irish myself, and I know what you're talking about, that sense of Irishness that we as a community have. But equally there's a sense of Scottishness, or a sense of being Welsh, and indeed, I'm sure for those of you who are English, there's that sense of English identity. So what I'm trying to tease out of you, why was it sort of so much more a loss for the Irish? Is that part of the Irish psyche?
It's part of being Irish and what Irish is and what it means to you and your own identity. So child migrants, if they were Irish, had an identity of being Irish. And they're suddenly in an institution in the outback of Australia, where they're being savagely called, you're the sons of Irish whores. Put all that together and you're a child. And you don't know where mummy and daddy is. And you don't know if you've got a grandma or a grandpa. And all you know that the people that are supposed to care for you, give you safety, give you protection, are harming and hurting you. And you're also, when I talk about trauma, I'm also talking about the trauma of seeing other children hurt and degraded. That is a long-lasting trauma. The feeling of watching another child being taken to be abused and feeling, I'm glad it's not me. And we've heard all about that in other situations, haven't we, in history, where people feel that's with them. And that's what I talk about. The trauma of all of that remains to this day.
And you do actually give some direct quotes from people who came from Northern Ireland and were sent to Australia, and if I might just read those out. We will hear directly, obviously, from some of the people themselves who will come to speak to the inquiry, or whose statements will be read, but these are just some others. And you say that I arrived from Termanbacca in Northern Ireland as a 10-year-old. I was small for my age, having suffered rickets in Ireland, and was a thin, nervous and vulnerable little boy. I clearly remember the fear and confusion that followed our landing at Fremantle. It was a nightmare. We were taken on the back of a truck from Fremantle to Clontarf. Our clothes and everything we had from home were taken from us. The only contact we had from anyone was from angry, shouting men. At 4.2, I was 8 years old, a very small and sensitive boy who cried easily and was quite unable to protect myself from bullies. I remember the heat, the flies, and the smells when we arrived. It was overpowering and frightening. Never for a moment did I believe this was going to be a holiday. I missed home. My suitcase, brought all the way from Belfast, was taken from me. My clothes were stripped off me, barefoot, naked, and sunburnt. I was given a pair of khaki shorts, a shirt, and put to work. No underwear, and worse, no shoes. I had to walk barefoot on burning hot gravel. We were handed to some older boys who laughed at us as we struggled even to stand on the burning ground. I was terrified and in pain. This was a terrible start. It never improved. My entire childhood in Australia was one episode of bullying after another. They nearly destroyed me. It was not just the physical assaults and degradation that damaged me. I remember craving affection and desperately, genuinely trying to please the brothers all the time so that they might treat me more kindly, or at least less cruelly. Instead, I was mocked, ridiculed, beaten, and exploited. I was beaten by nuns so many times they used a big stick like a curtain rod and swiped at my hands. If I flinched, they would whack into my legs. I so often had bad bruising and welts from the stick. They used to come up from behind and box my ears. That was so painful, hitting me across both ears with the flat of their hands, made me dizzy and sick with pain. I remember the nuns pulling my hair, dragging me by the hair, and then another beating. They told me I was a lazy, stupid cow, just like my mother. I remember crying myself to sleep with the pain and loneliness of it all. My whole life has been so hard. I've always had to work long hours for very little money because I was only ever trained to do domestic cleaning. At 13, I was taken out of school, told I was too stupid to educate. Even when I was very young, they made me scrub the concrete floors on my hands and knees. My joints are so painful I can't kneel anymore and my back is terrible. My doctor says my body is just worn out from so much work, and it all goes back to those cruel nuns. I saw terrible things happening all around me. Particularly cruel and distressing was the treatment of children who wet their beds. They were made to sleep out on the open verandas, exposed to the freezing cold at night. They were beaten and humiliated. I vividly recall seeing them all standing naked, being hosed down with a high-power stream of water. Just little kids. The constant threat of severe physical assault haunted me throughout my time there. I never felt safe, never slept easily, was permanently on alert. I was very jumpy and twitchy. You would all the time hear screaming and wailing as some poor sod was being flogged and tortured, but there was nothing I could do to help them or myself. I've been left with chronic anxiety and a lot of anger. My wife will tell you I have no idea how to relate to people or just be relaxed in company. I'm very wary of men, especially loud, confident men. I had no idea how to parent my children or even how to cuddle and love them. I really don't know what love is. I just try to do right by people, but most of the time I feel more like I'm watching than joining in. I feel very ashamed at my lack of education and wish I could have done more for my family. I left there barely literate. I could read, but not really comprehend the meaning. So I could not express myself in writing, and anything that looked official filled me with such anxiety that I would avoid dealing with it. I feel enormously resentful today. They stole my future along with my childhood. Constantly I recall being told that I was there because nobody wanted me. I was always being put down, told I was worthless. Another time I was walking down to the workshop and he called out, "Come on over here, copper top, you bluey." I had red hair. I didn't know what he meant. He came after me and said, "Didn't you hear me?" And then he belted me with a wooden batten used to fix roof tiles 4 or 5 times, knocking me to the ground. Those are just some examples of what you have been told by child migrants, all of whom were sent from Northern Ireland. And you describe the prolonged psychological damage from such layers, as you describe, of loss and trauma. And you say that that needs to be investigated, but you will appreciate that what happened to those children in Australia is outside our remit, and we can't go there, but it is right that their voices are heard. Section 14, you describe the specific work that you have done in relation to reuniting child migrants with families in Northern Ireland, and talk about the positive benefits thereof. And I know today you've brought along a map, which I think your lovely assistant is about to display for us.
It's just an example of where the Trust has worked in Northern Ireland. So
and I think it's quite graphic. If I could just ask Ian maybe to open that up, and I hope everyone can see this, but it gives an example of the spread of throughout the entire jurisdiction of Northern Ireland where child migrants, I take it these dots represent where you located their families.
Where we've located their families,
rather than where they had actually come from themselves, because we know they came from essentially 4 homes.
That's where families are that we've worked with, their families of child migrants in Northern Ireland, and you can see it's across.
It's across the entire jurisdiction of Northern Ireland, and in fact goes across the border into the Republic, into to Galway, Sligo and Cavan and so forth. And when I say they came from 4 homes, there were other child migrants who came from non-Sisters of Nazareth homes, and I know that you've also worked with those child migrants too. I
mean, could I just say mothers of child migrants and families, mothers, families are often found outside of Northern Ireland. So they may be in America, they may be in London, wherever they are, wherever we find them, we go to visit them.
So essentially that map is not the complete picture?
No, it's not the complete picture.
We'll see if we can get it pinned up to the wall so that everyone can see the distribution. Whether we can manage it or not, but we'll try anyway.
Okay.
If I may go on then, as I say, you're relating in Section 14 some of the reunions that you were able to facilitate. And if we can scroll on down to Section 15, you talk in Section 15 about the Trust's involvement in seeking to achieve social justice for the child migrants. And this is something which you mentioned, which is relevant to the recommendations which the inquiry will have to ultimately make. At paragraph 15.7, you give the example that of some of the things that have been done in Australia. And one of the examples is that in Western Australia there's a statue depicting 2 child migrants holding suitcases, which was positioned near the Maritime Museum in Fremantle where they got off the boats. And I can tell you that those who travelled to Australia from the inquiry have been able to see that for themselves and brought us some photographs back. But what I wanted to ask you about, you talk also about apologies by the governments, how important were they, and I'm going to come to that in a moment, but I wanted to ask what these various things that were done in Australia, the memorials, the redress, the apologies, what is the child migrants' view of these steps that have been taken in Australia?
Well, I'm sure that they will be able to tell you themselves around those things. So mine's just an overview. What it has had the most beneficial impact that we have seen for all child migrants, as far as we've seen, has been the 2 national apologies. I think that they have given recognition, they have given acknowledgement, they have given a promise that this won't happen again, and that we will do all we can to not forget you again. Gordon Brown's apology made that clear. Along with that apology, and if you look at national apologies and what are they all about, there was an expectation that justice would follow. And in a sense, this inquiry where child migrants from Northern Ireland are concerned is part of that. And again, the Royal Commission in Australia is building on that apology. that we're listening, we're hearing, we will do all we can. So when you come to things like memorials, I think there are different views on it. I've heard child migrants say, that means nothing to me. I want my mum and dad. That does not tell the story of child migrants coming here. It doesn't tell the story of multiple rapes. It doesn't tell the story of our life here. It says we came here and we're still here. But so much more is required. So much more. And that moreness is a sense of justice. And what is justice and what does it mean to people? Then the question has to be put to child migrants and their families, may I say, as well.
Yes, I was one of the things is that the families are very involved because it's part of their history too and their need to know.
This is family history. It's not just the child migrants' history, it's the family history. And it becomes a generational history. So I think things like remembrance, symbolic gestures, while perhaps they have a place, what I'm hearing from child migrants, that is not their need.
Can I just ask one question about redress? And you talk in paragraph 1512 about the patchwork quilt. Effectively, that the Australian redress schemes have been that there are some people who have received financial redress, others who haven't. And I was wondering, is there a sense of resentment among those who haven't received redress, or has that been your experience?
I don't think there's a sense of resentment from child migrant to child migrant. I have never picked that up at all. But a view, a collective view, that they all require redress. Everybody requires redress to be considered. What is it for? Why is it needed? Child migrants have the answers to that. So there's a lack of fairness. There's a lack of joined-upness, actually. That's what this all requires, I think, a joined-upness to all of it.
Well, if I can come back to your report, you say in the final section you outline what the Trust considers still needs to be done, and there is, in your view, work to be done, and one of the things you talk about are the continuation of redress measures, continued funding of independent specialist professional services. If we could scroll down through the next page, please. Present management of records, lacking organisation. Things have improved in Northern Ireland, but you think more streamlined access to the records would be good.
There have been improvements, but more could be done.
And as you say, measures to support the spirit of the National Apology.
Yes.
And continued funding for the Family Restoration Fund, which has allowed people to travel over to meet their families, and legislation to ensure ethical independent practice that does not compound the original damage through intervention by past service providers or perpetrators of historic abuse. And finally, coming back to the appendix to your report, which you set out the case study of Patrick. Patrick is someone who has spoken to the inquiry, and his statement will be read later this week. And you set out in this appendix the difficulties that he himself experienced in seeking to find his family, even as recently as 2008. And I know that you have a box with you, which is simply the measure of difficulty, if I can put it that way. It's an example of the measure of difficulty that you had in accessing the right records in order to find out where Patrick came from and his history. And perhaps rather than me go through it, you might want to explain exactly what, with reference to your report if you wish, what steps the Trust did take in his case and what the difficulties were.
I'm happy to do that. This inquiry is historical abuse, but do you know, for child migrants and their families, it's now. It's still going on. It's the present. And this, if you like, timeline is really to help us be aware that this is now. There are things that need to change now. So this was recent. This was Patrick, who could have met his mother. His mother could have met her son. We had been looking for years. The agencies involved said they'd given all the records. After years of looking for his family, in particular his mother, having done a DNA test on 2 Irish families and both were negative. So imagine the trauma of a family living, somebody knocks on the door, do you think this is your relative? Here's the birth certificate. These things all lead us to you, but we don't know the DNA. It says very clearly, this is not the family. Yes, a lot of circumstantial evidence has brought you here, but this is not the family. So other families, we're intervening in other families' private lives, when the records, if they had been given to us, would have stopped all that, the absolute waste of resources. But more importantly than all of that is that this child migrant would have met his mother, and she would have met her son, and it would have all have been all right as well. This mother never moved from her home address at all. So, do you call that deception? Do we call that deceit? Do we call that whatever it is, whatever motivates this, it lacks compassion. It fails to address human rights. It fails to deal with rights and responsibility arguments. And we got there just too late. So if I could just say that all the time that we were looking, and he himself had been looking for years, investigating, all the time that particular institution had this piece of paper signed by his mother. And that was all that was needed. And within 3 days of getting this, we found the family. Mother had died. While we had been looking, and in fact in this particular case, I came to Northern Ireland with Patrick, who lives in Australia, because like a lot of people, you know, they have to trust. Child migrants don't trust easily. Why should they trust us more than anybody else? And he would constantly say, you're not looking. You keep coming back here, you haven't found them, you're not looking. So will you come and look with me? You have some control as well. You be part of this. And so he came back to Ireland for the first time, and I was with him when he came back to Ireland for the first time, and he kissed the ground. That's what I mean about being Irish. People don't arrive in London Heathrow and kiss the ground, I can assure you. I have never seen that. And he kissed the ground. And for 3 days, we went to lots of presbyteries, day and night, knocked on the door of presbyteries, spoke to lots of priests, looked at baptismal records. They were all so welcoming, so helpful. Sometimes it was 8 o'clock at night, we'd be knocking on the door, standing there saying, can you help, please? But it didn't lead anywhere. Were they difficult? Did they not want to happen? Absolutely not. Absolutely, they were not. But then, much later on, a couple of years later, this is produced. She died during that time. In fact, actually, when we were knocking on these doors, his mother was alive and about half an hour's drive from us. That's what he has to live with. Now, a statue in Fremantle does not help him. I can assure you it does not help him. But this would have done, and this would have helped his mother. So this was all we were given. This is it. And this is the work it took to find her. I went to America. There was a lady in America by her name. That's what it took. So this is the life of a child in care, a decision you make to send this child to the other side of the world. This is it. When we were knocking on doors, she was alive, no other children, living with her family, about half an hour from where we were. That was in Northern Ireland all the time. So when we talk redress, let's look at contemporary issues. Sorry about that.
No.
I think these are things that we really have to take on board to stop it happening to other people.
Dr. Humphreys, you'll be glad to know that I have no further questions for you. Thank you very much for your time and again for the detailed report that you've provided to the inquiry. The panel members may have some things that they want to ask you, so if you just stay there for a moment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Humphreys, thank you very much. Thank you for the way you've, I think, really represented the voice of child migrants. We'll hear from them themselves, but I think you've done a wonderful job this afternoon. One of the things that I was very, I suppose, touched by in your report was not just about too late mothers being dead, but also unsuccessful reunions where time had passed too much for a reunion to be something that was successful for both the mother or the family. Could you just talk a wee, because I think that's an impact that needs to be remembered as well.
I think reunions under these circumstances and with the passage of time, they're highly complex, particularly for mothers and fathers, and particularly for mothers who are sometimes elderly and frail. And they themselves are visiting their past, their young years, and everything that's gone before. So it's a very specialist piece of work, I think. And what are all the things that need to be in place to help that be as they would both want? Guilt is a big factor. We have to kind of take that on ourselves, actually. Society's guilt. What is it all about? How do we understand it all? So what are the things that help reunions be fulfilling, meaningful? I think I've talked a little bit about the independence that is required, and particularly, often people say to me, "Are you from the church? Are you from here? Are you from there?" And you can see the difference when you say, "No, I'm not. I'm not that." So these are all legacy issues, aren't they? Legacies of all of this that people carry into their old age. So what helps a reunion be meaningful? I think good planning, respect and regard for everybody, looking very closely at what each particular person needs, requires. How is this going to happen? Where is it going to be? What is a failed reunion? What is it? For child migrants, there cannot be a lot of failure to know and to have what we all take for granted, a photograph of your mother, of your father, for the first time in your life, and you're 40, 50, 60, 70, is a huge, hugely changing experience. It's moving from dark to light. I didn't know and now I do. I couldn't see and now I can have an image of my mother and I can see her. So failure, whatever that is, for a child migrant is, like everybody, what is the big unspoken fear? Rejection and abandonment. Rarely happens, very rarely happens. Mother and father live with the child. Sometimes they only have a photograph of the baby, of a toddler. Who are they going to meet? A grown adult man and woman. That's the challenge. That's the leap. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
I just wanted it out. Thank you.
A couple of points, if I may. In paragraph 3.9, you said how their childcare experience in Northern Ireland institutions effectively groomed and demoralised the children and sort of prepared them for further assault in Australia. And I just wondered whether you felt you'd picked up anything from the people you've spoken to about what the quality of childcare was like in the Northern Ireland institutions, what their philosophy was, what their approach was to childcare.
Well, the impression I get, it was a culture. There was a culture of a lack of respect for the child, a lack of individuality, rather cold, brutal institutions. That's what comes over quite clear. But beyond that, more recently, I'm sure you're going to hear that from the child migrants themselves, is sexual assaults, criminal assaults, the kind of assaults that if a parent had done that to a child, the child would be removed and the parents would probably have had a custodial sentence. Then to be sent away, I think the questioning recently is this why I was sent? Was I sent because somebody was going to find out about the abuse? An apt quote somebody said to me a few weeks ago, and then I walked straight into it from the minute I arrived in Bindoon. It was the same. I think that's where that expression, the inquiries help give an expression to memory, to experience, don't they? And I think this is what's happened. It's a trigger. You've given permission for the trigger. And so it is being talked about a lot more now. So I think that when we talk about, was this grooming, I think some of this heightened awareness is also coming from evidence that is being given to the Royal Commission in Australia. So if we're looking now at the life of a child, and that life in terms of Northern Ireland started here, and you're looking at here, and it's gradually merging into there.
And have you picked up anything by way of positives about the childcare experiences people had?
I'm talking about just Northern Ireland
Yes,
now, so I'm focusing on that,
Ireland.
and of course. Well, I think people had different experiences. So if you most certainly had different experiences. If you talk to people who went with different schemes, I think you would say, what are the strands that runs across all of it? It is lack of identity, loss, fragmentation of identity, all of those things, confidence, self-esteem.
Okay. Thank you. And one other question, if I may. The recommendations you make at the end, were there any of those that you wanted to expand on, other than the ones you've already talked about?
I don't think so. I think that most certainly in terms of Northern Ireland, particularly, that the records should be in a central point. I mean, I think there should be in a government department, and I think there should be a clear protocol. And it's not too late for that. It's not too late. We still need to find families. And I think that's something that should be closely looked at.
Thank you.
If I might just follow up on the last thing you said, Dr. Humphreys, you said that there are still searches for families,
Yes.
is that right?
Yes.
Now, we are examining somewhere in the region of 130 individuals, and I think, I can't remember exactly, but you have been able to carry out searches for just under 60 or so from Northern Ireland. How many more, I don't mean an exact figure, but are we talking in terms of 10, 20, 50, or the remaining 60 or 70?
Can I write to you about
Is
that
it
so that I can give you a really
Well, I think it would
looked
be
at
very
figure?
helpful
But I
if
mean,
you could.
it's going to be 20 or more, that's for
Yes.
sure. You know, at the moment we're in the middle of a very complicated inquiry that's gone on for years. Northern Ireland, where the mother cannot be found anywhere at all. Mother never been in touch with her family since 1949. They've never seen her. Since then, they've never had birthday card, Christmas card. She's never been in touch with her siblings. We can't find her anywhere. That's where a central point located, we could have this discussion. What can we do in Northern Ireland to find this mother? What can we do? We have to do something. Time's running out. She's 90 now. Her son is 70.
Well, it would be very helpful
Yes.
if you could give us an indication, because that example underlines very dramatically how difficult, complex, and time-consuming these inquiries can be, but they are urgent, so
Yes, they are.
it would be very useful to us to know that.
May
Well,
I write to you about that? and
Yes,
give
that
you-
would be very helpful indeed. And if there are any further thoughts on the nature of such a central location, please feel free to add them, insofar as you may want to add to something that you've put in your written evidence. But can I thank you on behalf again of my colleagues and myself for giving us an overview of the impact on child migrants of the experience to which they were subjected. Because our concern, of course, is in part at least to see whether their experience was the same as those other child migrants from the remainder of the United Kingdom, or whether, as perhaps you have indicated, it was more acute for local reasons, and we have to have regard to that. But if I may say so, your experience in this field needs no commendation from me, but we're very grateful to you for coming and sharing it with us today. It'll help us enormously.
That concludes today's evidence, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Humphreys. Can we keep the map?
Yes.
Thank you.
Not for long.
Well, I'm sure we'll be able to copy it in some way or other and
Yes.
post it back to you. But it is very, very informative indeed. We leave it there for a day. In fact, we leave it there for the duration of the inquiry, because it may well help in other contexts as well. Thank you very much.